As you may know, Pixavasia regularly organizes events where we are in central Vietnam or wherever we are when we travel on our photography tours. Recently, we had the chance to have Peter Stewart, an amazing photographer who's actually based in Hoi An and a friend of us, talking about his technique of composite photography. So it's really not the kind of photography that we used to talking about on our workshops or on our tutorials, but it's a very interesting way to see what you can do, the possibilities and the potential that photography offers when you travel around the world. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. It's a little bit long, but really interesting. You're gonna see the way Peter scouts a location, the way he comes up with his concepts, the way he takes his photos, and the way he edits his photos using Photoshop. I hope you enjoy.
To actually organize these events, photography events in central Vietnam once a month. We are based in Hoi An. We run Pixavasia and Hoi An Photo Tour, which we teach photography here. So it's been over 10 years that we teach travel photography and photography in general to people in Hoi An and in Asia. And we meet up with a lot of people, we meet a lot of photographers, a lot of students, but we kind of feel that the community in Hoi An Da Nang, the photographers, like we want to meet you guys and we want to hear from you guys. And we do have pretty special people who come to visit us sometimes, like Peter here, who do really amazing things. And what we would like to do is to bring these people to you, just to show you everything you can do with photography. Yeah. So everything we can do. We specialize in travel and people photography. What Peter is going to talk to you about today is very different. It's really not what we do as photography, but it's something I would have loved to see when I started photography. I'm sure there's a lot, you're going to learn a lot with this presentation. So the idea is to try to involve everyone in these free events, to show other photographers, to share things about photography, about travel. We would like to organize, not maybe every month sitting in a room like this. We could have photo walks in Da Nang, in Hoi An. We could organize workshops and expeditions, things like this. And we want to get to know you. We want to know what kind of photography you like, you are into, what kind of things. And this is very important. I will come back to this at the end. We really want to hear from you today. What we would like today, at the end of the presentation, we really would like you to tell us ideas, things you would like us to talk about in future presentations. We could be talking about editing, Lightroom, Photoshop. We could be talking about composition, about travel. We could be talking about traveling to this and that country, the experience you have if you go to this or that place. We could be talking about many things. We would like to hear from you what you would like to see, maybe. We will keep inviting people, like Peter, because there are really a lot of great people around. Let us know, okay, on social media. But before we finish the presentation, before you leave today, we'd like you to leave us a note with ideas. So think about it, okay? I'm going to leave Peter to his presentation. Before we do that, one more time, look where you are, guys, yeah? Look at this room. Honestly, look at the quality of this projector and image and the sound we have. Thank you, Tan. Thank you, Anduk, for having us here, for helping us with all these events. Amazing stuff. If you guys don't know Tan yet, and if you didn't know Anduk, this camera shop, it's basically the best camera shop there is in the whole Vietnam. Peter? Oui? I leave this to you. Okay.
Grab that one. That's
A little bit louder.
we can put it down. I don't know. Can we dim it a little bit, actually? Can you dim it a bit? I think on is for now, but we'll gauge it. Okay. Right. Okay. Firstly, Etienne. This is my first time public speaking, presenting my photography really to an audience. So. So I'd really like to thank Etienne for the opportunity to speak today, and for everyone coming, thank you very much. So for those not familiar with me, my name is Peter Stewart. I'm from Australia originally. I've been in Asia now for about 10 years. In 2009, I first started traveling. I left the UK, where I was living for about 12 years beforehand. Arrived in Hong Kong, and I bought my very first DSLR. I had a little Canon EOS something or other with a basic kit lens. And from there, it was just fell in love with photography instantly. You know, arriving in a big foreign land and discovering things for the first time. So really, that's how I got started, like I imagine many of you did as well. You come over on a holiday, perhaps, and you get your interest in photography from there and the world around you. For me, my main interest was cityscapes and architecture. So I started off really doing quite a broad range of topics, like I would shoot macro photography, and I'd try and shoot wildlife, and I'd try and shoot, you know, travel, go to the wet markets and things like that, and do street photography. But for me, I was more interested in focusing on the architecture, the scale that you find in cities. And from there, that's really how I've built up my portfolio over the years. And I've been fortunate enough now to have been published in some pretty large magazines. Really happy that National Geographic gave me the opportunity to give me a magazine cover a few years ago, and also a book publishing as well. On top of that, a few giant companies as well, like Apple and Google, have also licensed my work for their promotional content. Google used some of my images as wallpapers for the Pixel line of phones, and Apple, I believe, used it for promoting the iPad, one of the iPad launches a few years ago. From there, I've started printing my work, and this is really where the journey has kind of really leapt up in the last couple of years, and the photography side of things has really taken off to the point where I can be self-sustainable. I can follow my own projects and do and shoot what I want. So I started selling and offering my own prints, and just by sheer luck, one day I got an email from a large art gallery offering to represent me, gave them a handful of works, and then from there it's just built up and up over the years. So I'm really thankful that that's kind of the niche area I've fallen into, where I've been fortunate to just be able to completely do my own thing and follow my own ideas. So yeah, that's me. That's a very old photo of me, by the way, when the hair was slightly less grey. I think that was taken in the Galapagos Islands about 5 or 6 years ago. But anyway, that's kind of a basic intro from me. So moving on, I'd just like to show you just some examples of my work if you're unfamiliar. So as I mentioned earlier, I started in Hong Kong, and this was really my main interest. Getting unique angles of the architecture you find there. You know, it's amazing sometimes what you see where you put on a wide angle lens and you just look straight up in these cities. You know, the mass urban density of everything really kind of draws me into places like Hong Kong and Tokyo and Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, cities like that. So that's really where I tried to hone my skills. Here's some more shots. There's 2 from Hong Kong as well. This is more kind of, in the last couple of years, I've been playing more with using telephoto lenses and shooting from high vantage points to really compress the landscapes together. And really, these are the kind of works I like to have them printed large so that people can view them up close, and there's always just little miniature details and things, new things to explore every time you look at the image. Next up, same, these are kind of straight-on facades. This is kind of more the work I'm known for, I guess. Again, another shot in Hong Kong from my architecture series there, where it's just showing the scale of everything and using colour and lighting to really sell the image. But I do also branch out sometimes. I do occasionally like to shoot landscapes. So this is a shot from a couple of years ago in Yangzhou in China. Has anyone else seen this spot before? I think it was made popular by Trey Radcliffe, the famous HDR photographer. So I kind of tried to steal his idea and try and search for the location sneakily, and then I found it. And hopefully, I think I'm one of the few people after him to have gotten that shot. And then here, just another architecture image where I like to explore lines and symmetry and patterns. And then last two. This is a shot from Tokyo a couple of years ago in an office block that I took. These are all real images, by the way. I'll go into later some of the manipulations that have gone into them, but these two images in particular are 100% real. There's no Photoshop or anything going on in there. I think so, anyway. There might be something sneaky in that one. Okay, so what I want to talk to everyone about today is composite photography. So this might be something you're all familiar with. But if not, you hopefully should get some new ideas today. What I really want to do is just show you some examples of how you can use composite photography in your shooting to, explore new ideas and, just come up with some really unique images that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get on your own in a single shot. So to start off with, what is composite photography? By definition, it is an image constructed of two or more photographs that are then overlapped on top of each other. The general uses for it, I would define it as being used to either add new elements into a scene, subtract elements from a scene, or just completely replace them. So what I mean by that is, when I say adding, if you take multiple shots in a row of a busy street, you can then add individual people into it later on. You can do the reverse, subtract. So say you go to a really busy tourist area, like say you're in Hoi An, and you want to take a nice shot from across the bridge of all the buildings. You've got all the tourists walking along. If you take multiple shots in a row, you can then later in Photoshop merge them together and erase all the people out of it. So some general uses for composite photography. I think the most common one people will be familiar with is sky replacement. Has anyone done this before with their images? You like to keep it nice and pure photography, yeah? This gained attraction, I'd say, about 10 years ago, and I will argue it's been a method that has been overused and abused, myself included. I try not to do it quite so much anymore, but it is still sometimes a valid method for a composite, where this image I took in Bagan a few years ago. It was a sunrise on top of one of the pagodas, but I just wasn't getting the lighting that I wanted. It was one of those bland sunrises that, the shots from Bagan that you see, it's not really famous for. So I took another shot that I'd taken from, I think that was on a beach in Australia somewhere, and then I just put that in the background. It's not something that I would, like I said, I try not to do it too often. And when you do, I still feel it's important to, to let people know. Don't ever try and pass this off as completely what it is. Okay, another use. So as I mentioned earlier, you can add or subtract elements in a scene. So this shot here is from a hotel interior in Singapore. I wasn't given permission to shoot there, so I had to sneak up into one of the top floors of the hotel, and they wouldn't, there's security guards and cleaners and people wandering around. So I had to be kind of sneaky and try and get this shot quickly. And what I wanted was all the elevator capsules, I guess you call these, kind of in certain positions, all coming up and down. But I couldn't get it in one shot, it was impossible. So I knew I had to get multiple shots whenever I could over the space of, I think it was 5 or 10 minutes, and I had to do this handheld as well. So I got all the different elements that I needed, went into Photoshop later, and then simply composited them all together. Yeah, that's one of the most common uses, I would say. This is usually what I do with a lot of my photography. Another common one is to increase the dynamic range. Is anyone here familiar with HDR and bracketed exposures? And then you merge your different brackets together. This, again, is another simple form of compositing, where in the example here, I've taken an underexposed shot of this, this tower in order to preserve the highlight detail. And then I've taken my overexposed shot. I think the one on the left was maybe 2 or 3 seconds. So it's not long enough. 2 seconds at night is obviously not long enough to expose the whole scene, but it's enough to preserve those highlight details. For the second shot, which was about 20 seconds or so, the detail, the fine detail in the tower there and some of the lighting and these neon lights, that's all blown out and non-recoverable. So by using HDR and bracketing, you can then merge your images together later to get a more balanced exposure. With HDR, you can obviously do this automatically via software, or you can do fancy methods like exposure blending and such. What I like to do is I'll simply layer them on top of each other in Photoshop. I'll add a mask, and then I'll just paint in the details back in. Next one's an interesting one. So another use is to insert separately filmed elements, which I think Etty and I agree, we call it, faking it, fake it till you make it. This is not one I do really often. I put this together simply for the purpose of the presentation. But this is actually, there are legitimate uses for this, such as I think in the fashion industry, a lot of fashion photographers will shoot their models separately in different locations and then go around later on, cut them out, and paste them into the scene. It's a lot more highly skilled having to do this in order to make the element you're inserting realistically blend in with the environment. I think if you were to view this image up close and scrutinize it, you would very easily be able to tell that it's not real. So, for me, why I'd use composite photography is simply just to take your imagination beyond what is possible to get in a single image. And for me, this whole idea started in Hong Kong, where one day I was standing on a bridge. This is a pedestrian bridge. So I stood there one day and I was just watching all the traffic going by and thinking, oh, this is a nice enough composition, but it's a bit, it's a bit boring. And I noticed the red taxis coming down the street. And of course, just like in New York City, they have the yellow cabs. In Hong Kong, the red taxis are an iconic symbol of the city. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool just to have a whole road full of red taxis? Be a very iconic kind of Hong Kong shot, but it's not something that's possible to get in one take. So that's where I thought, I'll use compositing. So this took about an hour of shooting. I took about, I think, maybe 100 or 150 images of all these taxis. So these cars are actually there. This is real in the sense that wherever they are placed in the screen, that is where they were when they were photographed. They've not been photographed somewhere else, cut out, and then slapped onto the image. So yeah, in that sense, parts of it are real, but this is the type of photography that I really try to pursue, and I keep trying to, come up with new ideas, where I can pull off little tricks like this. What I want to show you now, this is another image I took from a different vantage point, doing the same thing with the taxis. This is kind of like a time lapse of it all, showing you each individual frame that I shot. So you can think of this style of photography as being similar to shooting a time lapse as you would for video, except that when you're shooting a video time lapse, normally you set an interval, take a shot every 3 or 5 seconds, you press the button, leave the camera to do the rest. With this style of time-lapse photography, you're manually firing the shutter. You're controlling when you want to press the button. But I'll just play this clip now. It's just a short 30-second clip. But this is all the frames that I took. So as you can see, there's lots of regular traffic, lots of things in the frame I don't want. And then later on, when I put all these frames on top of each other, I'll simply erase the bits I don't want. Long time to put that together. a very long time. This was one of my first attempts at doing this as well, after I got the idea and I thought, well, how can I think about putting all this together? And a lot of the time it's just trial and error. You know, I really wanted to fill the entire scene completely with taxis. But as you can see, there's a few little gaps here and there and such. So yeah, there's certainly a learning curve to it. I'd like to show you just a few more examples of this style and how I've used it. Again, another shot of the taxis that I did. This, I think, was the last one that I did, so it's a little bit more polished in terms of look and how I've placed everything in the scene. And then here's a shot from Ho Chi Minh City. So this one was slightly more easy. I went to this, some of you may know it, it's like a coffee shop on top of the hotel that overlooks the square. So I knew when I went up there I wanted to capture the rush hour traffic. But that's kind of easier said than done. You might think that this is a typical scene you could see in Saigon every afternoon. You know, if you get up high enough and look down, you might think it looks exactly like that. But believe me, when I went and tried to do it, I realized the traffic is actually controlled a lot more than I was hoping for. Some people do actually stop for the traffic lights. So I had to shoot this in blocks. So think of it as being split into 4 parts. So I took one shot of traffic when they were down here, one shot of traffic here when they come through the lights, one shot there, and so forth. Because I think in reality, you're not going to have traffic kind of hitting into people there. But for me, that was the vision in my mind that I wanted. I wanted to completely fill the whole scene with motorbikes. And yeah, I think I mildly pulled it off. Next sample, this is a more kind of a simple way of looking at doing one of these shots. In Hoi An, what I was talking about earlier, when you could stand on the opposite side of the river. Imagine erasing all the tourists that walk along in the afternoon. So what I did was I took about 50 odd frames or so, just waited for the basket ladies to walk past. Obviously, if you were to look at this scene on its own, like a single shot with her in the frame, next to her are dozens and dozens of tourists. So by taking more frames, I'm able to completely wipe them out and then just add in little elements, unpaste kind of the elements that I want to reappear in the scene. Okay, so how do we create these types of shots? What I want to show you today is an example from Hanoi I took a few years ago. I want to go and take you through the process of how I conceptualized this, how I prepared for it, how I shot it, and then finally show you a live demonstration on this actual image of putting it together. I'm not going to do the whole thing because it will take about 48 hours, but I'll show you a few quick frames, how I actually paste these back into the scene realistically, and so forth. So from conception to execution. First stage, of course, is the planning. So I'm going to show you how I'd go through location scouting and previs the scene. Then the setup, camera settings, and the equipment, what I use to get these kind of shots done best. Then shooting, how to make sure you get all the right frames for these kind of composites, because sometimes you can do all the planning, but then you turn up on the day, you get 50, 100 frames, but you still come back and you've missed something. So I'm going to give you a little tip on how you can avoid that. And then obviously the editing stage, putting everything all together. Okay, so stage 1, location scouting. How do you find a suitable shooting location? That was your idea, that graphic. Okay, so for me, shooting these types of scenes, you're stood somewhere for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours doing these. So it really is important to make sure you're asking yourself, am I able to stay here without being moved on for a few hours? keep in mind if you're doing imagine you're doing this in a big city, a big crowded city. So I always make sure I get permission to shoot wherever I am, whether I'm in the top floor of a coffee shop or I've gone up into a rooftop car park, for instance. I want to make sure I'm not going to get halfway through the shoot and then someone's going to come and kick me out. Next, of course, like with the Saigon shot, I want to make sure I'm not blocking the flow of traffic if I'm shooting at street level. If I've got my tripod set up in the middle of the road for what I have in mind. What? But, oh yeah. So I want to make sure, yeah, I'm not going to be blocking anyone by setting up a tripod in the middle of the road. I know it's quite common, it's common sense, but because we're all used to as photographers, we see a shot we want, we'll go to set up, and we'll just kind of block everyone in our path. But if we're only there for a minute or two, it's not a big deal. But it can be, of course, if you're planning to be there for a few hours. Next up is finding out, you know, what's the right time of day to do this. So I like to go to the location beforehand, figure out when the flow of traffic is at its busiest. Is it worse on the weekends versus the weekdays? Is the type of traffic different, you know? If I'm trying to capture taxis, for instance, the weekday traffic between, you know, businessmen and stuff going between office appointments, there might be more taxis during the weekdays versus at the weekends. And again, with rush hour versus daytime traffic, not always, rush hour traffic isn't always the best time for these types of shots because you've got a lot of, you know, vehicles overlapping each other. So you want to make sure you're getting clean plate shots of each, like say with the motorcycles, you want to get a clean shot of the motorcycle, not have a car or a truck driving in front of them. So you might perhaps think it's better to shoot this during the daytime when the traffic is less. But the general rule I try to follow is that, you know, the best time of day is always going to be the one that involves the least amount of time possible to get everything that I need. So, location scouting. So tripod setups. For me, I use a multitude of tripod setups. Obviously, I've got my main, this is a little travel tripod that I use. For these types of setups though, I try not to use this as much as possible. And the reason is that tripods can move. So I also use this little tabletop tripod. I'll put my ball head on there, set up the camera. That's not going to move at all. I'll also use this little clamp. This is a cheap little $30 Manfrotto clamp. I'll put the ball head on there, and I can attach that to any little railing or what have you. It's completely stable, not going to move, which is important when you're shooting these types of images. The camera, what you've framed up, it cannot move at all. So just as an example, this shot on the left here, this is the waterfalls in Laos. Where is it? Do you know? Luang Prabang, yeah. So if anyone's been there, they've probably walked on this little rickety wooden bridge. Lots of tourists coming back and forth. It's quite impractical to set up a tripod on there because people are going to trip over it and such. So a little simple thing like a clamp, you just attach it to that railing, can stand there for hours and shoot. The same thing here. This was up at Victoria Peak in Hong Kong. Again, it's a very, very busy touristy area. I was shooting a time-lapse here, and I just attached my clamp to this glass railing, and it's quite windy up there as well. But by using this little clamp, I can take hundreds of frames. I look at them later in Photoshop. Nothing's moved between the frames. It's completely dead still. So for me, if you're planning these types of shots, make sure you're assessing things like wind conditions and vibrations from moving objects. So if you want to, say for instance, you're shooting from a bridge, like the Dragon Bridge in Da Nang, you know, at the edge of the bridge is probably going to be the best place to set up, because if you move to the middle of the bridge, once a truck comes over, the whole thing vibrates. So always go location scouting beforehand when you're planning your shots, assess little things like that, because you might turn up on the day, never have thought about it, you go through all the planning for your setup, get there, and then suddenly your tripod's vibrating. 1 second. Okay, girls? Yeah? Cozy? Okay, so previous stage. When I'm out scouting and I'm thinking in mind, I've got one of these images in mind, I'll go up to the place beforehand, take my camera with me, and then assess kind of how I want to frame things up. You know, are there things in the scene I want to exclude, include, of course, just like, you know, you're framing up for any shot. With these types, with these two shots, for instance, I needed to pre-visualize them because I wanted to make sure that I was getting coverage for the area I was framing up. So just imagine I've used, I think, you know, a 28 or a 35mm lens for this. I framed it up. I want to make sure I'm getting traffic that's going to come all across that frame. If I frame it slightly too wide, there might be gaps in an area around like a, you know, a corner up here where vehicles just don't pass through. So it's always, for me, important to go beforehand, take these test shots and see if that composition I have in mind, if it's actually going to work, or is it going to require some, you know, extra little work in Photoshop later on. But the most important thing is to assess the way the shadows fall on the ground. So in this top example, this was one of the first times I did these bike shots in Hanoi. And I shot it on a, you know, you can see it's like a bright sunlit, you know, middle of the day, and you've got all these shadows cast on the ground. And when I was up in the coffee shop at the time, taking these shots, I thought, oh, that looks great, having these harsh shadows on the ground. What I didn't realize at the time was, of course, you know, shadows move. As the sun moves across the sky, you can see here you've got shadows going in this direction and then some of them randomly going in that direction. So it kind of, it spoils the illusion. In the example we're going to look at today, you can see it's a little bit more muted. The shadows on the ground are a lot more softer. So for me, that just makes it 1,000 times easier in the editing stage when I'm putting it all together, because these soft shadows, of course, they're not directional, and they're a lot easier later on to mask in compared to these harsh shadows. Okay, so essential equipment. We've talked about tripods before. I just want to take you through quickly, if I do have to use a tripod setup, kind of the best practice for it. So for me, for instance, I use this little kind of lightweight Gitzo tripod. I'd prefer to have a more heavyweight tripod, as I'm sure some of you do, but for the purpose of traveling, I like to keep you know, my whole setup kind of as lightweight as possible. So I use this little thing, which is fine. Hello. Hello. So this is fine for kind of general use. But of course, you know, if you were to take it to Iceland or something, it would completely fall apart. So obviously, you work with what you've got. But if you're going to shoot any kind of time-lapse-based photography for the purpose of composites, you want to make sure your tripod's as stable as possible. So for me, I'll try to use the minimum amount of leg extension as possible to get this thing as stable. So when you extend all the legs, all 3 legs all the way, so it's like that, you've always got a little bit of give in the thing, which is not by you touching it, but it could be, you know, vibrations, wind, noise, that kind of thing. Not noise, but, you know, wind and vibrations. So the lower you can have it to the ground, the least amount of leg extensions as possible, the more stable it's going to be. And if your tripod has a center column, like mine does, I'll always try to avoid using that whenever I can, because that adds a lot of give to the thing. And next up is the most important tool you're going to need for one of these. which is a remote cable release. I use a cheap little $20 one that I bought in China, and it gets the job done. This is the most important thing you're going to need for doing these types of shots, because once you start shooting, you absolutely cannot touch your camera, your tripod, your setup whatsoever. You just want to be able to dial in all your settings, stand back, and just push the button remotely. So you can use a cheap little remote like I do, or you can get more advanced ones that plug into your hot shoe, and then you can use your mobile phone and use an app to like trigger them off. Okay, so camera settings. What I do for these types of works is I always make sure that I want to freeze the motion, essentially. So like with the taxi shots or with these bikes, everything's moving across the frame super, super fast. So I want to make sure I'm using an adequate enough shutter speed to completely freeze it. In the example we're looking at today, I used a shutter speed 1/1000th of a second, which is adequate enough to completely freeze the motion. Secondly, I want to make sure I'm getting adequate sharpness across the frame. Traditionally, I like to use f8, and I'll stick to that for most of my shots. For this, I compromised a bit. I use, f7.1, which was enough to ensure that everything pretty much down in the corners, I'm getting just as sharp as in the center. So those are the first two settings I'll look at when I'm doing any kind of setup. I'll do my shutter speed first, and then my aperture, all completely in manual exposure mode. And then lastly, I'll use my ISO dial as a way to raise my exposure back up to 0. Next up, white balance. Not the most essential thing, really, but it's just good practice that I like to get into. I'll make sure I go in and manually set my white balance, or use one of the preset ones, like cloudy or direct sunlight. I think usually I'll just set it to like 5500 Kelvin and leave it at that. And the reason being is so that when I'm looking at I take a shot, a motorbike comes past, I take the shot, I see the preview on the back of the screen. 2 seconds later, I take another shot, preview comes up on the back of the screen. I want to make sure there's no color shifts between those two images. If you're shooting RAW, of course, this is not too important because you can adjust it all later in Photoshop. But for me, like I said, it's good practice, and also it's just, you want to make sure when you're reviewing your images while you're shooting, that you can see that consistency between the shots, so that if you're getting a shift in the light, the clouds have parted and the sunlight's pouring through, and now suddenly you've gone from a daylight white balance, or a cloudy white balance, to a daylight white balance. You might want to pause for 5 minutes before you take your next shots. And again, important settings, you want to be set to manual focus. If you're using autofocus for any type of exposure bracketing or composites, so even if you're shooting HDRs or long exposures at night, always use manual focus. So I go into live view and I manually set my focus that way. I completely disable autofocus. The reason being is that you're going to have shifts in the focus between each frames if you're letting the camera decide that for you. So very important, always preset, always focus your scene beforehand using manual focus. And then lastly is the image stabilization, image stabilization on your lens, or IBIS on your camera body. It's not always essential to disable it nowadays, because I think a lot of cameras are smart enough to know to disable it. But I always disable it just to make sure that I'm not having the sensor kind of cause any vibrations while I'm shooting on a tripod. And also, it does cause extra battery drain. And you can't go halfway through a shoot. You've got 50 frames taken of the 100 frames you need to take, and then you find you're running out of battery. You can't change battery. You've only got one battery you can use. sorry this is a little bit text heavy, this is the last one, but I'll just reel off some of the last little bits of settings that I like to use. So obviously, if you're not shooting in RAW already, you really should be. Recording in RAW means that you've got the freedom in editing and Photoshop later to really manipulate your images, compared to JPEG where that locks in the white balance. I'll also set my shooting mode to burst so that even though I'm not touching the camera when I'm taking my shots, I'm using the remote, but I want to make sure that if a motorbike passes through the frame in the area where I want to capture it, rather than just take one shot and then, oh, I missed it, I can hold down the remote just like you would hold down the shutter button on your camera and take a few burst frames. Next up, I'll make sure that any kind of battery saving modes are disabled, because if there's a pause, you need to take a gap in your shooting, you take a shot and then nothing comes through for the next 2 minutes, you don't want your camera to accidentally turn off and then you have to physically touch it to turn it back on. So you can go into your menus and make sure that something like turn off after 1 minute or turn off after 3 minutes is disabled. Secondly, so image preview, usually switched on by default on most DSLR and mirrorless cameras. I'll just make sure it is switched on so that every time you do take a shot, you can still look at the back of the screen and see what you've taken. And then lastly, I'll disable the rear LCD so that that's not in action, that's not turned on in between shots. You'll still get the image preview, but after that, your screen goes black. The idea being, you really want to save your battery. Okay, so now, with kind of the previs done, you've done your location scouting, and you've got your camera settings, everything ready, you're there on the day, you're now ready to go. So now, just imagine we're ready, we're going to start taking all the frames we need for the composite. And the most important factor to think about is time. You want to try and get everything you need in the least amount of possible time before things like the sunlight changes and you've got shifting shadows or things like that. So to start with, I'll take something called a background plate, where I try to take a single frame without any people, any traffic, no nothing in it, and that's going to later be used in Photoshop as my starting layer. It's not always possible, of course, in a busy scene like in Hanoi to get these types of shots. I think I got lucky with this one. But if not, just wait for gaps in the traffic. If you've got one person walking through the frame or two, take one frame with that person, combine it later, and then erase those people out. And then you can just save that as your starting frame. So that's kind of the first step, how I like to start all these kind of projects. And then from then on, once I have that shot in the camera, I don't touch the setup at all. Everything from then on is with the remote control. And for the next 30 minutes, 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, I'll try and get, obviously, all the shots that I need. So now, we fill the frame. It's quite simple. You just take shot after shot until you get everything. And that's how I do it. Just wait for an interesting subject, pass through the frame, take that shot. Later on, everything's going to be overlaid in Photoshop, and I just erase the elements I don't need or add them in. 1 sec. And just a last little extra tip. You want to keep an eye on your exposure meter while you're shooting this. If you've got a DSLR, you've got the little LCD screen on the top. I'm not sure quite how it works on the mirrorless ones, but for me, I shoot with the DSLR, so I have that little LCD on the top, which is always on. So when I'm shooting, every kind of couple of minutes, I'm just keeping an eye on that meter to make sure that my exposure isn't going, up and down as the light naturally changes. I've typically found, like you can see here, there's a little bit of a shift in the light. This frame's a bit brighter than this frame. They might have been taken 5 or 10 minutes apart. But in terms of difference, there's only about 1/3 of a stop difference between them, which is something that can be easily fixed later on when you're putting everything together in Photoshop. So as a general rule, I try to make sure everything's about a third, over or under, close to 0. That works for me. And that's it. That's the first part. So before I get into, I'm going to move into Photoshop and just show you an example of how I put all this together. Sorry if I did rush through that a bit quickly, but does anyone have questions so far? Yes?
The last thing that you mentioned, the exposure.
Yes.
The last thing that
Yes.
you mentioned about the exposure gauge or
This part, the monitoring your exposure meter. Yes.
the meter. Where is that and what is that?
So your exposure dial, if you're using, automatic exposure on your camera or AV mode or something, where your camera determines your correct exposure. Yeah. So your camera is trying to make sure that it's looking for 0, right? The ideal exposure on where the scene that's in front of you. Because with this type of setup, you can't have anything change. You want to take control of your camera settings, so everything must be in manual. So that's why, because I've set a manual exposure beforehand, I've metered the scene myself, or I've gone on auto exposure and got the correct exposure that I want for this, but then I lock it in manual. But of course, over the course of half an hour, it's inevitable that lighting kind of dips and it brightens and stuff. So that's why I think it's important to keep an eye on that meter, because to your eye, to the naked eye, you don't always notice those changes in light, but the camera, of course, will pick it all up. Okay. More questions, anyone? Yes. Don't be shy. I'm the shy one today. Okay, okay. All right, so I'm going to move into my Photoshop demo here. Just give me 1 minute. I'm going to have to try and a Lightroom user, but that being said, part of the process here today can also be done in Lightroom, but in terms of the editing stages, that does need to be finished in Photoshop. Okay. So I'm not going to go through, obviously, every single image that's used to make these types of shots. I'm just going to show you kind of 2 or 3 samples. But to start off with, so we've got our background plate loaded in here. This is going to be our starting point, basically, a completely blank slate. And from there, I'm just going to load in, 1 second. Need 2 hands, mate, to do this. Yeah. I might need Mr. There we go. Okay, so just for the purpose of the demonstration, I'm only going to go through three examples here today. In the original folder, there's about 100, I think 107 shots or something. Is he making a face behind me? Okay. I'm okay, okay. So here's our 3 shots. We've got our little film reel up here in the left. So that's just the 3 we're going to work with today. And if you do use Photoshop, when you load a raw image into Adobe Photoshop, you're presented with the Adobe Camera Raw interface, which is very, very similar to the Lightroom interface, just perhaps slightly more advanced. So we've got our 3 shots here, which I kind of handpicked beforehand. I like this lady, the fruit basket lady. And then the second shot here, this guy carrying his little, what is that? Little cabinets and stuff. And then lastly, this guy here. So what we're going to do is paste all 3 of these together over that background plate. I've already gone ahead kind of beforehand and just applied some kind of you know, quick settings as you would with any image you're editing in Lightroom. So I've gone and applied some basic adjustments. And then once I've done that, so, you know, I'm going to lower, raise the highlights and stuff. I'm going to go up to this top left corner. You see the mouse in the top left corner? Go to the film strip, press there, and go sync settings. And then just press OK. So any kind of changes I make to one image, I ensure it's applied to all of them. And then I'm going to load all 3 of those into Photoshop. Takes a minute. Its computer's not as fast as it used to be. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so these are just the .nef, they're Nikon RAW files. Because I've opened them from the Finder window into Photoshop, that Camera Raw interface always pops up first, yeah. Yeah. It does, yeah, I think with TIFF files and like JPEG files, it doesn't. It automatically loads it into Photoshop, yeah. There might be a menu setting so you can tell, you know, open these types of files in Camera Raw beforehand. But, for instance, you know, I've loaded my images here. If I want to go back and change something again, I can go up to a filter, the filter menu up at the top, go filter, Camera Raw, and then it loads it back in, so I can continue making changes. So it's like a bit like having Lightroom inside of Photoshop. Okay. So we're going to we'll go back and forth between this completed image. So this is the final shot that I edited, and you can see here these are elements that were used. So the lady's in there somewhere, he's in there, and yeah, he's in there too. There's a few little colour differences and stuff, but apart from that. So we start off, we've got our background plate. I'm going to take this shot, this frame here, just Command A to copy. This is going to be really hard with one hand, mate. Go back to my background plate, paste that on top. So I've added a new layer, a new element on top, which is kind of like that. And then I'm going to add a mask. Oops, actually. Option click. So option click adds a black mask, which basically erases everything. So we've still got our layer on top, but it's hidden at the moment. So what we have to do is kind of unpaint using a white paintbrush, and that will reveal the things that are hidden in the layer.
Just when you're doing this, when you import or overlay the picture that you're going to reveal,
Yeah.
you completely edited that. That's not going to be touched again. Like everything is the highlights, contrast, you're happy with it.
No, there'll be edits later, but yeah, what I like to imagine if you're working, you put all these into Lightroom beforehand, you know, or I'll load all 100 images, or I'll load 1 or 2, and then I'll make kind of my basic adjustments, highlights, shadows, saturation, that kind of thing, your basic edits, and then I'll click Apply to All. And I'll also ensure that this background plate, this base layer, that matches the exposure levels and the colors of all those other images as well. Because, of course, you know, you have to make everything match as closely as possible. You'll see that's not always possible. As, you know, some of these, like this shot, this shot, this shot, they may have been taken 20 minutes apart. So there might be variations in the exposure and kind of the white balance and stuff. So you might have to do some little tweaks afterwards. As we go into the edit, we'll see if we have to. Okay, so we've got our lady here. I'm going to take the paintbrush tool, set that to white, and then we can just unpaint her, paint her back into the scene. So if we look closely, there's a little bit of an exposure difference. She's slightly darker than our background plate image. So what I'm going to do is select the layer. Then I'm just going to do a basic levels adjustment. Just go here to the midtones and just raise it ever so slightly till it matches the background plate better. I think about there is fine. Yeah, that will do. So now we've got her inserted into the scene, and at a distance looks completely realistic. You couldn't tell if that was composited in or not. It gets more difficult as we start adding more elements, obviously, and they start overlapping each other, and I'll show you how I mask in an overlapping element. But just as a basic starting point, if you're doing a composite image and you don't have elements that are overlapping each other, you can quite simply just boom, 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 layer them all in Photoshop, add a black mask, use your white paintbrush tool, and then just unpaint them all one by one to make them appear. I think that kind of technique is, I think, used a lot in the fashion industry when they're shooting models separately. Like they have to have them all, everyone has to be together in the same room at the same time. Not always possible. So someone like Annie Leibovitz, she has her camera tripod set up. I think she did this when she shot the Queen. The Queen and the Prince and everyone. They weren't always in the room at the same time, so she had the Queen in the middle, and then when Prince William or whatever came in, she made him stand here, knowing that this empty space is where she can put him in later. And then, of course, she probably did the same, a very similar method to this, where she's just unmasking each element. Okay, so next up, we'll put this guy in. So again, I'm just going to select this, Command-C or Control-C, go over to my background plate, and add this as a new layer on top. And then I'm going to add a black mask to that frame. So that's hidden, and we can do the same thing where we can just paint him in like that. But I'm not going to show you that way. What I'm going to do is get rid of this layer mask, and I'm going to use the lasso tools up in the top left corner, which can be used for cutting around objects. So hopefully you can see this on the screen. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a rough kind of scissor around him. All right, so I'm going to cut him out. But what's most important here is you can see there are shadows on the ground. So I want to make sure I get a little bit of coverage around there so I can put those shadows in. Come on. Okay, so then once that's done, I go down here to the mask, add layer mask, and click that. So now he's masked in, but as you can, I hope you can see, there are little faint lines around him. So I'm going to select the main layer. I'm going to do the same thing as before, as I did with the ladies, just to try and match the exposure to make it blend a little bit better. Because this is the thing, like as much as you can try on the day, in terms of things like, you know, keeping an eye on your exposure level, making sure it's set to 0, you know, you can't control all these elements, these changes in the lighting. It's always going to happen. So the best you can do to kind of control it by just keeping in mind some of these little tips of settings, that's really all you can do. Okay, so I'm going to try and make him blend in with the background a little bit better because he's a little bit underexposed compared to the base layer. So I'm going to Layers, and again, just manipulate the midtones. Kind of brighten him a bit. I think that's about right. So we'll do that. And then I'm going to go back to the mask here. I might zoom in a little bit. So you can see it doesn't quite match. You can see these little joins here. I think that's from the shadow she's casting. I'm going to switch my paintbrush to black. So that's going to be remasking. And then I'm going to paint. And that's just going to get rid of those kind of rough lines. I want to make sure not to get rid of too much of his shadow though. But other than that, that matches just fine, I think. A bit of dark, maybe. Maybe a little bit more of a levels adjustment. And there we go. Another little tip, a tip for editing though. Going back to what I was saying at the beginning about things like thinking about your tripod setup and obviously the location you're shooting at, you've got to keep in mind beforehand things like wind conditions and the stability of the environment you're shooting in, like if you're on a bridge or something. Because try as hard as you can, even if you don't touch the camera for an hour, somehow you still get little vibrations from, if you're using a DSLR, from the mirror going up and down. So you still get, at the pixel level, vibrations and movement between shots. So if I were to zoom in all the way here, almost to the pixel level, and I unhide him, you're going to see that very slight shift between the pixels. Luckily, we can kind of get away with it here because we're on a gravelly surface. But what I want to do is go in and kind of shift this element a little bit, like a couple of pixels, to make sure it matches. So I think this element's kind of up and to the left a little bit. I'm just going to set my opacity down a bit to around maybe 50%, which just makes it easier to match in. I'm going to go to my, what is this called, this tool? Is it the arrow tool? The one on the top left. I think it's called the arrow tool. I should know more Photoshop things. Select my element here, and then I'm just using the arrow keys on my keyboard here. Just want to move one pixel at a time. So I'm just going to press go left, that moves him left, and then up. Was that the right direction? No, it's the other direction. Let's go down. So I'm just going to try and make this match as much on a pixel level with the element below. So I think that's about right. So then if I unhide it and then reappear, that's spot on now. So that's now correctly masked into the scene. So that's our second element. Now let's try and introduce something a little bit harder. We're going to choose this shot here, this guy with the big pole on the back. Put that layer on top. Now if I just lower the opacity a bit, you can see here, if I'm going to mask him in, he's going to have to be layered, part of him is going to have to be layered on top of that bit behind him. So this is where these kinds of shots, and this one in particular, this is where it gets a bit more time consuming once you start having to edit on a pixel level. So you can shorten this process as best as you can by using things like your lasso tools and stuff. For me, I like to I'm more of a mouse user, but you can use like a Wacom tablet with the pen. But to mask these elements in, which I'll show you in a second, I'll actually zoom right on in at a pixel level and start with a really small paintbrush tool. And I'll start painting around the edges kind of painstakingly to make sure it all matches in. But to get started, let's just do a rough, I'll do a rough cut around him with the lasso tool, just to get the edit started. The tricky part with this one, I think, is because you can see at the bottom, his motorbike casts a shadow, which of course is hidden, obscured a bit by that little red motorbike in front of him, and we're not putting the red motorbike into the shot. So I'm going to have to finesse it a little bit by probably not masking in all of his shadow, of the shadow of this bike. So I might use like my paintbrush tool at a lower opacity and kind of just make the shadow of his bike a little softer. But anyway, to start off with, we've added a little lasso tool around him. I'm going to add a layer mask to him, add a black mask. So now he's in the scene. And as you can see, he overlaps this element here. So this is the hard part of the editing process, trying to make it all match on a realistic level. I'll just do a base with the paintbrush tool at 100%. I'm just going to do a rough kind of sketch around. There we go. And also the areas in between his arms as well, we need to mask in. Went in a bit too much there. Okay, so this is the real time-consuming part, because you know, you've got to really go in at the pixel level and make sure that all these little bits, and even like you can see like in between his basket here, you know, we're going to have to make that a little bit darker as well to make the shadow from the bike come in. So it's all these little things you have to think about when you're editing it. This is what kind of makes the process take so long. You know, it can take hours and hours, but this is how I constructed these ones. I think this image, if I just go back to the final image, I think in total this took me about 2 days, maybe a good kind of 20, 30 hours of editing to put it all together. So yeah, what we'll do here, we're just going to start kind of painting in, maybe with a smaller paintbrush. Make sure we get everything. So yeah, it's certainly a lot more time consuming than your typical standard editing. Personally, you know, if I can get the shot in camera in one go, obviously I will. I'm not, you know, trying to make life harder for myself if I can avoid it. I'm sure that there are many ways you can actually do this type of editing that can be, you know, computer aided in this to a certain sense. Especially with things like HDR photography, you know, you can use software to blend frames together, and you can certainly, to a certain extent, do this type of compositing with some computer software. But I've never, ever been satisfied with the results of them compared to just, you know, a lot of hard work just sitting down at this pixel level and making sure everything's masked in properly. I think it's always going to be a lot more realistic than you would have just by letting the computer do it. You see here, so we've got a little bit of kind of, you know, shadow overlap here where the basket is. So sometimes if you just need to like finesse a little bit of the image you're overlaying, just reduce your opacity of your brush. So I'm just going to put it down to maybe 20%, and then I'm just going to enlarge like this, and I'm just going to paint over a part of the handlebars there. Doesn't look quite so realistic, but we'll go back to 100%, and just repaint the bars back. Whoops, wrong one. Repaint these bars back in. Ooh. Make that lower again. Okay. Obviously, if I was to spend, you know, you spend a lot more time on it, you can make it look a lot more realistic. That's the basic sense of it. Let's just get the rest of this in, and then we'll see if it looks any good or not. There's our basic shadows. Does anyone have any questions at the moment while I'm going through this stage? Any basic questions, but even if they're Photoshop related or unrelated to this?
It's never a problem when like they're stacked on top of each other because none of them will look like will overlap in like this sense. But as long as you have it on top of right, it's right itself. It won't like
Interfere with other elements, or
like if you put this dude below.
Well, this.
He's gonna go behind.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the reason, look, you can do kind of the cheating method where I've got these two guys here, but say I don't want him here, I want him here, you know? I want to move him here, I want to mask him in here. You can do it that way if you want, but you're always going to have issues with like the shadows and such, you know? Yeah, this is just the most natural way of doing it. So it's, you know, camera lockdown, one framing, you know, wherever the people land, that's where they're going to be masked into the scene. Because once you start kind of taking an element and moving it around, no, I want to place him here rather than there, it does just become a lot more harder to mask. Because then you just, like with this, how I'm having to go down to the pixel level, you know, I don't want to be doing that for every single shot. I can get away with, on this shot here, for example, I haven't gone completely down to the edges and masked this out because the background is the same regardless of whether he's there or not, so it makes it a lot easier. I'm just going to try, I'll go quickly through this, try and just mask him in so that we can zoom out and have a semi-completed image to look at. I'm just going to paste past this box back in. But this is the same process I've used for the, you know, for those taxi shots you saw earlier. And that's even like the simple shot in Hoi An as well. And there'll be a few more examples later. Okay, getting there. So now we see if we were to zoom out there, forget about the, oh, actually, I'll just do the shadow because I'm going to try and finesse this shadow in a bit because remember there was that red motorcycle there before, so I couldn't quite get all of his shadow. So I'm going to just try and finesse that a bit. So I'm going to lower my opacity down to here, just try and do some sneaky. Maybe a bit like that, a bit less. There we go. So if I were to zoom out and you look at it, almost looks like those three bikes were photographed together, you could say. The shadow's a little higher on him though, so we'll raise that. There we go. So if I hadn't told you anything and I just threw this image up on the screen like this, would you think that was a real image, or would you suspect it was a composite, or do you suspect it's a composite only because now you know the process and you're thinking, I can see little details, little things that give it away? Or would you think that was a realistic, that was one shot? Maybe? Well, thank you. It might be possible one day. If you know, taxi drivers do have a habit of going on strike, so maybe one day I'll be able to get it for real, you know. But yes, at a basic level, so what we started with this first element with the lady. Without any other, you know, she's not overlapping or interacting with any other elements. So I can just use that, you know, the paintbrush and just paint her into the scene. The second guy, kind of a similar thing, but as you saw, there was a little bit of like that pixel shift at the pixel level, so we went and moved him around a bit. There might be a pixel shift as well with this third element, you never know. So these are the things you have to do every time you're masking every new element you're masking in, you have to be looking at the, if there's any changes in that color temperature between them and the background. Are they darker or lighter than the base element? So you saw me raise the levels, the midtones a little bit. And then the hardest part is like with this type of thing where you've got one element overlapping another, and you really have to kind of get in with the paintbrush, kind of, what was I was at 5 pixels wide, and really kind of going at those edges to make it look absolutely believable. So yeah, so that's the process. That's how I've generally applied it each time I've shot one of these. I would say when I started shooting it, like when I showed you the 2 images of Hanoi, and you could see the one on the top with the harsh shadows versus this image. So that top image, that was the first time I did this kind of thing, and it was only later when I started editing I realized, oh, those harsh shadows, like it makes it so much. Not only does it look unrealistic with shadows going off in different directions, but it actually did make it a lot harder when it came to doing this masking stage. Because with the soft shadows, you can kind of cheat a bit and paint them out, at lower opacities, and it can still look somewhat believable. What have I done there? Oh, I'm painting on the wrong layer. Whoops. It doesn't matter. But anyway, so yeah, that is the basic process. And that's how I made this final shot. So that I think I mentioned earlier it was about 100 or 110 frames in total. And if you feel free to count how many are in there, I haven't, but I imagine it's about 40 or 50, and they are all individual elements that I chose. I just went through. In Finder, or if you load them into Lightroom, I just go through each picture and I'll put 4-star, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star, mark which ones are the frames that I'm actually going to use for the composite, and then leave all the 1-star images at the bottom, which are kind of like my last, I quite missed. I'll use that. So in this image, I think there's only a handful of them, maybe up in the kind of the top right corners where the traffic's a little more boring, a little less interesting compared to all these guys down here. So that again, talking about coverage as well. So when you're framing up for these shots, when you're going scouting, you need to make sure that you're going to get coverage everywhere. This little area down here where the lady is and her, you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. There actually wasn't a lot of bike traffic coming through that day. Everything's going there in that direction and there. Does anyone know this location, by the way, in Hanoi? It's in the main square at the top of Highlands Coffee. It's that spot, the spot that everyone takes the shot of. It's the roundabout in the old quarter at the top of Highlands. So I put I can't remember if I used the clamp or maybe this for the setup. But I went in, I asked the staff, and they said, you can stay here all afternoon. Buy a banh mi, you're good. So I was there all afternoon, put the camera over the edge, had my little wireless remote, and I just sat there drinking coffee, and every 5 seconds, see something interesting, ooh, go. Yep, interesting. Made a little note on my notepad, and tried to get all the coverage I needed. But what I realized afterwards was that what I'd planned in my head the day before and framed up, I wasn't getting a lot of traffic along the bottom here. So that, I think, like this guy here and here, I had to wait a lot longer than I thought to actually get them, because I probably would have put like an extra little bike down there or something if I had the option to. But yes, that's the final image. There we go. Oh, yes, please.
Have you, over time that you've been doing it for long, developed like a style of you start from a certain corner or you start from the center up and how you layer?
Good question. Yes, sorry, I meant to say something similar to that. When I'm going through all the files, like I've got them in Finder or what have you, like I mentioned earlier, I'll put the 5-star, the best ones that I want to use, I'll go 5-star, 4-star, 3-star. And I'll always start building with the best images. So to be honest, when I first edited this shot, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I'm pretty sure I started the same way. I've just started now with her in the center. And then I build it out from there. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. I do like to start with the simple ones that are simpler to blend in. So I'll try and, fill in there. And then so I'll leave the harder shots till last, where you have to start overlapping things. And things like the smaller vehicle traffic up in the corner, they're usually kind of the last elements to get blended. It's really up to you, though, how you start editing, whether you, like for this, you start from the middle and outwards or from a corner. I think going back to the taxi images from earlier that I showed you, let me find it. So like with this shot, it's really simple. You just, I'll start from there, right? I need a car there, and hopefully I'll go through my Finder and be like, I hope I've got that shot covered. Okay. So, that's a Photoshop demo. Now, I'll move back in. So now, just like to play, it's just a fun little guessing game. If you can tell whether the image is completely real, it's 100% real shot, one take, in camera, or if it's, digital manipulation, fakery, whatever you want to call it. These are all my images, though. So I'll move in. Number 1. That's the marina in Singapore. Does anyone think do you think it's real or a composite? Yes, at certain times of year. So, is the sky what you think gives it away, yeah? Yeah, just the way the sky moves, yeah? What about with the water? How would I get the water like that? Yes, so it's a long exposure, a daylight long exposure. It's a 10-stop, I think a 10-stop filter. So obviously with the sky as well, you're going to have blurring and motion in the sky. But you think it's a composite, yeah? Or some form of, yeah? Okay, it's real. But it's a panoramic, which is why it's stitched like that. But that is the raw file with no edits to it, out of camera, but just with the stitching applied. So it's, long exposure on the water and this sky pattern as well. There was just a very bizarre sky pattern that day that caused that, and then when I stitched it together, it came out like that. But even in the kind of the individual raws, and I'm shooting it panoramically, vertically as well, so it's a vertical panorama. Even in the sky there, you can see all these kind of weird kind of gradients and stuff. So yeah, that's it's a real shot. Next. So this is Hong Kong Harbour, the Chim Cha Choi waterfront, where you have the famous ferries that go back and forth across the harbour. It was just one of those days where you get a super cool, talking about pollution, of course, famous for it in the middle of summer. So we had these kind of light beams going through all the buildings and stuff, and then the boats going across. But what do you think? Do you think that's real or faked in some way?
The sky looks like something from Lord of the Rings or something. Mount
It's
Doom.
the tower. It's
And
the
the
tower.
tower is there.
The Tower of Sauron.
Yeah. It's just missing the eye on the top. Feels natural to me, but I suspect it might be manipulated in some way.
I mean, so keep in mind that this is, regardless of whether it's a real image or not, whatever I'm going to show you, I still edit my images, so I manipulate color and contrast and everything like I imagine most people do. So there's still editing in all of these images regardless, but it just in terms of, is it real or is there some form of wizardry, compositry going on?
It's just that sunspot.
Here?
No,
There. Up here?
Yeah.
Okay. So everyone thinks that's a composite? Yeah? You sure? Just because I showed you the last one was a real image doesn't mean I'm going to flip-flop to a fake one. It is a composite. So, as you know, you can see I've moved the two boats together. In the first shot, this was the shot that I really liked, but then I noticed flicking back and forth through the images, which you shouldn't do when you're locked down on a tripod, by the way. But I was doing it, and I noticed, oh, like there's cloud coverage up there. But I loved where the sun was positioned here. So the light rays were just perfect, and I had the boat there, and I was like, yeah, that's perfect. But I want another boat here, and I want to get rid of this tugboat. So without having to go in and clone things out with a Photoshop brush, I simply merged these two images together. And so I put the boat back in there. I kind of moved a bit of the sky back in, as you can see. So the tower from there. Oop, you didn't see that. And I kept the sun from the first image. So you're mentioning earlier the sunspot up the top. Yeah, it's real. It is in there. Because I used the sun from this image up from there. I just put the boat back in there and a little bit from the top up there, and then gave it some, you know, your usual color adjustments. So yes, that is a composite. Next up. So this was not a shot that I planned for. It kind of happened by accident. This is in a little town called Oji, which is near Kyoto in Japan. I found this spot on Google Maps, and I'm a bit of a train nerd, so I like taking pictures of trains and planes and stuff like that. It's not the kind of stuff I'll put on my Instagram. But I've researched this bridge online, and I thought, I've got to go to this spot. I love the way that, you know, you've got this river here, the local JR trains that go into Kyoto come across. It's just one of those kind of shots that I wanted with like a nice bright blue sky. I was envisioning some kind of Studio Ghibli-inspired image I'd create. But I got there on the day, it was raining, it was like this, and thought, well, I'll work with what I've got. But the question is, because this was not something I planned for, but it just happened on the day, do you think this is real or fake? And what would give the game away by analysing it?
I would say that you weren't able to get the train like that. You had to use either 3 or 2 or whatever, and then find the right one so that the train actually marries up together.
Yeah.
You weren't able to get the train.
Or I could have just cut it in half, flipped it over, maybe.
Couldn't there be more shadows on the lake from the sky?
Shadows in the what, sorry?
And more reflections or something
On the water.
On the water.
On the water.
Because of all the clouds in the sky.
You're onto something there. So like the last image, this one is a composite. What I used was this is a long exposure shot on the left. Again, like camera's not moving between shots, I just take the ND filter off. So I took a long exposure because the clouds that day were just completely crazy and going super fast, and I thought this will look great, you know, great for like a 1 minute long, moody, long exposure. So I got that shot, and then within my mind I'm thinking, I'll take the filter off, wait for the train to come past, you know, and I'll composite the train into the image. So it's just kind of as a simple idea, I thought, great, that will work. I'll merge the train with the long exposure, and it looked great. But when I got back into editing, I realized that the clouds from the actual train shot were, you know, a lot stronger, a lot more what I had in mind. But I didn't like the, you know, the river, this kind of just dirty, grim-looking, wintry river. So I merged the long exposure shot at the bottom and also at the sides as well, just to get rid of the foliage. So it is quite dark. It's not, if you on a monitor, it's not quite as pitch black as in the corners here in the projector. But yeah, so that one's composite. Okay, next up, my back garden in Hoi An last year. Burning fire. What do you think? Is there anything in that picture that makes you think there's something not right about this image? Has a what? He has a helmet on. Yeah. As in, it's too dark. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's two ways of looking about this. The image is real. The image is real. In terms of manipulation, it's heavy manipulation in terms of the color and contrast. So I added like a bleach bypass filter to the road in front. I really wanted this image to kind of look as punchy as possible, and to a certain extent, a little bit over the top, you know. So yeah, it's a real image. I mean, there's, you know, like a fly in the there's a fly in the lens or something that I've cloned out. But yes, that's a real shot. It's just very heavy use of editing.
Were they burning the rice fields? Yeah. Or is it smoke, or is it?
It's smoke from after the harvest. Yeah, yeah. Okay, next one. So this is from Macau. A couple of years ago, I took this one. Any thoughts, anyone?
How many shots?
Or do you think that's a real image in one? No?
Of course not. No, so
Of course not. It could be. But you know me well now, Sir John, don't you? So can you elaborate? What do you think was used to, or how this was put together?
no idea. But perhaps there's a mirror image and maybe like a double mirror image perhaps as well. That's a possibility. Perhaps.
It's the same as before, like with the train, right? Saying it's split in half kind of thing, flipped over, or do you think? Okay.
Or quarters? Would be also quarters.
I'd have to be the laziest photographer ever if that's like. I'll shoot a quarter of this building and I'll just paste it 3 more times. Done. I've got a photo. So yes, this is a composite in the sense that it's an HDR. It's a bracketed exposure. So which is, I like to say that's a form of composite photography, where I've taken what my camera determines is my balanced exposure. I've taken an underexposed image, although not that it matters because it really was like it was a really overcast day, so the sky was white regardless of however I tried to expose it. So for me, that was fine. And then this is my overexposed image here showing the depths of the buildings, because it was actually, you know, I'm looking up in the middle of a courtyard there. It's very dark though. So I had to bracket my exposures just to make sure that I had enough to work with later when I go and edit.
Peter,
Yes.
when you take this shot, do you have a flippy screen, or are you basically laying down on the floor looking at the camera?
I use a Nikon D810, which unfortunately does not have a tilty flippy screen. So no, I'm not a part of the tilty flippy screen gang yet.
So you're laying down on the floor, like a camera here?
I'll usually extend the second or third leg of this thing. So it's about kind of that height, and then just so I'm down there, and then I'll look up. But I'll use the, what do you call it? You know, the little meters inside that tell you where you're balanced and stuff. What do you call it? You know, this thing. But like the digital one on the camera, yeah. Which works, yeah, it's still a little awkward, but you've got to find little workarounds for it. One day I'll join you, Fujifilm people. Okay. Any thoughts?
Some painting.
So what do you think? It's a daytime image, a daylight image, with something speeding through, or is it obvious that it's a train? What do you think?
3 trains at the same time, you're pretty lucky.
So, okay.
And also, like, the water looks sharp, so, and the trains are long exposure,
Yeah.
so I think they're...
But if you think about a train, to actually get that kind of motion blur on a train, you don't have to shoot for like 30 seconds or anything. You can normally get it after about 3 seconds. That kind of level of blur. I'm pretty sure these were no longer than it was like a 5-second exposure or something. But I haven't said yet whether it's a real image or not.
At 5 seconds, maybe the water would be a bit more moody and misty, I don't know.
Perhaps, yeah. But general consensus? Would you think this was a composite, or would you think this was just a lucky fluke all in one? Composite.
Also the 3 trains at the same time.
Okay.
And the colors of
The colors are not
too convenient.
Too convenient. Okay. Right. Yes, it's a composite. But you can actually get this shot in one if you're very, very patient. This is Tokyo, so it's not too uncommon. You have 3 or 4 trains passing through at the same time. But for the sake of convenience, I literally took this shot, these three brackets. Took me 2 minutes, I think. I just set up my tripod. I was walking past, saw the composition. I thought, right, I'll make something out of this. It's not the best composition. It's a bit kind of busy with lots of things going on. But I thought, well, maybe I can try daylight, long exposure, get the trains and everything. But I didn't want to wait around, So I got, 1 shot, 30 seconds later he came, 30 seconds later he came. The exposures were all identical, so it was an extremely easy thing to composite together. Okay. Who's who's familiar with the whole photoshopping planes into skies stuff that you see on Instagram? Have you seen these pictures before, anyone? It was a big kind of fad a few years ago where people would take shots like the shot you saw before, the apartment blocks all looking up. I'm not the only person in the world taking these photographs at these places, but lots of people like to go there, take that shot, and then they'll literally go on Google, type in plane, cut it out, and Photoshop it into the picture. I don't like to do that, but I'm known to be naughty from time to time. So this is a shot in Taipei from a mountain top. This is in the city center of Taipei. So why would there be a plane flying that low through there? All right, Etienne, Jesus. Get away.
Same as Denon.
It can be compressed.
Correct.
Yeah, very long lens, and it's in front of the city actually, but
Yeah, so it's on a, I think I had to borrow a lens for this because I only have longest I have is I have a 70 to 200. That does everything. This I shot at 400 millimeter, I think, or or maybe a 300, but it's a fixed lens. Yes, the image is real. It is real. That's the raw file. That's the raw file for it. It's a really cool spot, actually, if anyone goes to Taipei. Literally takes, you get off this metro station, 10-minute short hike up the side of this mountain, I forget the name of, but it's really super easy to find this spot. And I saw myself kind of wanted to be right down in the middle of this laneway here, of the highway. And just on your phone, you've got, the flight arrivals and stuff, so you can see the planes coming in real time. And then I just waited for, like in this instance, it was like a A330, so I wanted a large plane to come through. And of course, China Airlines are a Taiwan airline anyway. So that was the image I had in mind, and I managed to get it in one shot. So that is real. Right, this one. I won't provide any context for this.
this is like a vending machine graveyard.
Vending machine graveyard.
When they're nicely stacked in perfect.
How did you get to the top?
And why do they have
What if there's a ladder out of frame? There might have been a ladder out of frame, you don't know,
I
but
smell something fishy here.
you do. And it's not the cologne, and it's not your cologne. Okay, so you think there's something a little bit off with this. You can get this in real life. It is, I mean, you can see their photograph, that's a photograph, right? It's not a painting, or like it's...
I just can't imagine a place where so many vending machines would be stacked
Okay.
full of stuff.
Okay, so this image, from all the other images I've shown you today, really, this one I took last year, and it is in Japan. I think it's in Tokyo. It took me about a month, and it was the hardest thing I've ever had to composite together. So I walked around the city, and I actually used a pocket camera. I didn't use my DSLR. I used a pocket APS-C camera that I had. It's like 15 megapixels or something. And I just went around the city during the daytime, taking all these shots of different vending machines, trying to find new and different interesting ones, and also at the same time trying to make sure that I'm getting them under the same lighting conditions. So I was searching for overcast lighting. I noted down the camera settings like manually in my camera, so I was using 1/100th of a second at f5.6 or something. So I made sure I'm always using the same kind of settings just to get them all kind of roughly matching. There were hundreds of these. I took hundreds of these shots, and then it took just days to put it all together. But you can, from what you've seen today, you get an idea of how it's built, yeah? It's, cutting them out, using the little lasso tools, and then just finessing it at the pixel level. And then, I just stacked them all on top of each other, basically. Made a black background. I think I photoshopped some bamboo background something in, but yeah. So I was, that took a long time, but I was really happy just to, once I saw this completed, I was like, right, I'm really happy that I got the idea to just one day walking past the vending machines and thinking, well, wait a minute, wouldn't it be cool if? And then that's how that came about.